Native American History of the Land Beneath My Feet by Fran Feely. Growing up in South Buffalo in the 1970s and 1980s, I was only vaguely aware of the past presence of Native Americans in the area, despite many clues. Only recently, I became suddenly aware of this rich history, as well as its proximity to my two childhood homes. This presentation is the product of that journey. With all due respect to Native Americans, and fully cognizant of the misnomer Indian commonly applied to the indigenous peoples of North America, I will be using the terms Indian and Native American interchangeably, as the term Indian has not only been commonly used in historical records and documents, but also because the term has been used and continues to be used by Native Americans themselves, including members of the Seneca Nation, for whom Western New York has been home. I have made an effort to use the terms which the indigenous peoples used to refer to themselves, as well as names created by Europeans and often more well known by people of non-native descent. Indigenous peoples inhabited the land that is today known as Western New York thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans to North America. The ancient peoples of the Americas had established civilizations that were characterized by large settlements, agriculture, and complex economies. The Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse, are the indigenous people of the Northeast Woodlands. The earlier self-designation of the Haudenosaunee was Kanonisioni, which means League of the United Extended Households. The Haudenosaunee are also known as the Iroquois, a French term created by early French colonists. In this presentation, the terms Haudenosaunee and Iroquois will be used interchangeably. The Iroquois Confederacy consisted of 5 separate nations: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. Unity among the original 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee originated in the 1400s. A 6th nation, the Tuscarora, joined the Iroquois Confederacy in 1713 when they migrated from the Carolinas to western New York and northwestern Pennsylvania. The various nations of the Haudenosaunee had much in common, but were also diverse culturally and linguistically, with approximately 300 different languages. Villages of the Haudenosaunee were typically located in forest clearings near fresh water, as such locations provided the benefits of game, shelter, fish, drinking water, waterways for fast travel, and trees for constructing longhouses. Corn, beans, and squash were cultivated in the fields surrounding Haudenosaunee villages. These 3 main food staples were known as the Three Sisters. Over time, firewood and game became sparse, and the land became less fertile in individual villages, so communities typically relocated approximately every 20 years to allow the forest and the soil to replenish. Haudenosaunee communities were divided into 9 extended family units called clans. Extended clans related through the mother's line of descent. Clans were headed by an elder female known as the clan mother, who bore the responsibility of safeguarding her clan and making many important decisions. The 9 clans were the Turtle Clan, the Beaver Clan, the Eel Clan, the Deer Clan, the Wolf Clan, the Hawk Clan, the Bear Clan, the Heron Clan, and the Snipe Clan. Typical Haudenosaunee villages consisted of 30 to 150 longhouses. Typical longhouses measured 100 feet long, 25 feet wide, and 20 feet tall, although some were known to measure as long as a football field. They were constructed of cedar or hickory sapling frames lashed together with elm bark. Elm bark was also used for the walls. Holes were cut into the roof to allow sunlight in and to allow smoke to escape from the fire pits which lined the center of the longhouses. Each longhouse was the home to members of a specific clan. Children, parents, uncles, cousins, and grandparents from the same clan all lived together. Each family was allotted a space approximately 15 feet long. 2 levels of wooden platforms were constructed along the walls, the first for sitting and sleeping, and the second for storage. The longhouses were the center of family life only during the cold seasons. During the warm seasons, Haudenosaunee spent most time outdoors. Men hunted and fished in the forests, while women cared for the children and worked in the fields surrounding the village. French colonization, beginning in the 1500s, and British and Dutch colonization, beginning in the 1600s, encroached on native lands and resulted in interaction, trade, and devastating conflict between the Europeans and the indigenous peoples. The arrival of Europeans introduced diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and measles to North America, diseases for which the indigenous peoples had little or no natural resistance. By 1640, outbreaks of these diseases swept west to the lands of the Seneca. By 1650, the population of the Haudenosaunee had been reduced by half. Despite this great loss of life, the Iroquois Confederacy represented the dominant military power in North America in the 1700s. The Iroquois nations spent much of the 1600s fighting the French and Indian allies of the French. In 1701, a peace was established that permitted the Iroquois to benefit economically from trade with both the British and the French. Tension arose among the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy in the 1700s when the French and English battled each other and individual Iroquois nations supported different sides. The Seneca Nation usually sided with the French, but the Seneca Nation supported the British during the French and Indian War between 1754 and 1763. Iroquois and European colonial leaders exchanged political and social ideas during the 1700s. It is believed that the Iroquois' lack of class stratification and their representational form of government inspired some of the democratic principles of the United States Constitution. The American Revolution was a catastrophe for the Iroquois, as all but two of the Six Nations, the Oneida and the Tuscarora, sided with the British against the Patriots. The Seneca Nation supported the British. In 1779, General Washington authorized a campaign of terror led by American General John Sullivan, targeting Iroquois who supported the British in retaliation for the massacres of pioneer settlements at Wyoming and Cherry Valley by the British and their Seneca allies. The Sullivan campaign resulted in the destruction of hundreds of Iroquois villages, homes and foods and fields, leaving nothing for the thousands left homeless. At the conclusion of the American War for Independence, the British neglected to seek protections for their Indian allies in negotiating the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Many pro-British Iroquois moved to Canada to live on the newly established Six Nation Reserve in Ontario. Various treaties and land deals between the United States and the Iroquois resulted in the Iroquois losing most of their land and being provided several small reservations, among them the 49,920-acre Buffalo Creek Reservation in what is today the area of Buffalo, New York, in the central portion of Erie County, New York. Arrows on both maps point to the rectangle-shaped Buffalo Creek Reservation on the northeastern shore of Lake Erie. The Seneca Nation. The Senecas were the largest, most powerful, and westernmost of the 5 original tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy. Their self-designation was Onatawaka, Great Hill People. The Seneca homeland stretched north to south from Lake Ontario to the upper Allegheny and Susquehanna rivers, and west to east from Lake Erie to Seneca Lake, but especially from Lake Canandaigua to the Genesee River. During the 17th century, wars led to the expansion of the original Seneca territory between Seneca Lake and the Genesee River to include all of western New York State, from Niagara, south along the Allegheny River, into Pennsylvania. The Seneca village at Buffalo Creek was established in 1780. This territory was known by the Seneca as a place for hunting and fishing, but there were no Seneca settlements there prior to the establishment of the reservation. The first Christian missionary, Reverend Elkanah Holmes, arrived in 1801 and operated a school intermittently for 10 years. In 1811, teacher Jabez Bacchus Hyde arrived, built a school, and translated hymns and eventually the Gospel of St. John into Seneca. The first Indians were converted to Christianity August 16, 1818. Reverend Thompson S. Harris became the permanent minister of the settlement around 1821. The organization of the Seneca Mission Church took place on April 10, 1823. Opposition to the presence of Christian missionaries was led by Chief Red Jacket, who feared that the Christian missionary work was part of a larger plan to steal the Seneca's land. In 1824, Red Jacket sought to have the district attorney enforce the state law against white men living on reservations. However, the law was changed to allow missionaries to reside on the reservations, and they returned to Buffalo Creek in June 1825. In 1828, the Christian Senecas decided to build a church, which was completed and dedicated on August 19, 1829. The Indian church consisted of a 13-acre compound. The church itself stood in the middle of what is now Indian Church Road, just northeast of the present intersection of Indian Church Road and Galloway Street. Reverend Harris was replaced by Presbyterian minister Asher Wright. Minister Asher Wright and his wife continued working at the mission until the village was abandoned in 1846. Wright oversaw the construction and operation of the large white mission house, which was built on Buffum Street, roughly between present-day Galloway Street and Indian Orchard Place, in 1833. The mission house served as a meeting place and a school, with the purpose of educating Native American youths in the tradition of European, American, and Christian standards. In numerous ways, children were encouraged or forced to abandon their Native American identities. The Mission House on Buffum Street also operated a mission press, which published books as well as a periodical called The Mental Elevator in 2 languages, Seneca and English. Pictured on the left is the cover of a Seneca spelling book written by Minister Wright in 1842. On the right is the cover of the last issue of The Mental Elevator, published in 1845 at the Seneca Mission House, before Reverend Asher Wright and his wife Laura moved to the Cattaraugus Reservation to continue their work with the Senecas. The dissolution of the Buffalo Creek Reservation is described as one of the ugliest episodes of trickery in our history. The first Buffalo Creek Treaty of 1938 sought to eliminate all Seneca reservations in western New York. This treaty failed to be ratified because of objections to the many improprieties of the treaty, objections voiced by the Senecas and their Quaker advocates. The Buffalo Creek Treaty of 1842 eliminated the Buffalo Creek Reservation, but allowed for the retention of the Cattaraugus and Allegheny reservations. The Buffalo Creek Reservation was sold to the Ogden Land Company. Residents of Buffalo Creek were forced to abandon their homes, farms, and villages, and to leave behind the cemetery and its grove of giant walnut trees. The precise date of the establishment of an Indian burial ground on the site of Seneca Indian Park is unknown. Ephraim George Squire documented ancient Aboriginal sites in the Americas. He visited the remains of a major ancient site in present-day South Buffalo in 1848, a few years after the Buffalo Creek Reservation ceased to be. Squire said, "Tradition fixes upon this spot as the final and most bloody conflict between the Iroquois and the Eries." Squire published a map, shown here, that shows a ridge at the crest of a gently sloping terrace, partly circumscribed by an earthwork, or mound, in the form of a large D, enclosing about 4 acres. Later archaeologists estimate the date of the original mound site around 1500. The battle between the Iroquois and the Eries, referred to by Squire, occurred in the 1650s. The cemetery was in very close proximity to the Mission Church and Mission House. It was likely consecrated as a Christian cemetery around the time of the first Indian conversions in 1818, or when the church was first organized in 1823. Chief Red Jacket was a member of the Seneca Nation, a chief of the Wolf Clan, and a celebrated orator. He spent much of his childhood at Basswood Creek and much of his adulthood in the Genesee River Valley. Red Jacket took his name, one of several he used, for an embroidered coat given to him by the British for his wartime service to the British during the American Revolution. As noted earlier, Red Jacket and the Seneca Nation sided with the British during the American Revolution. Later, Red Jacket sided with the United States against the British in the War of 1812. Red Jacket played a prominent role in negotiations with the United States federal government following the American Revolutionary War. In 1792, he led a delegation of 50 people to Philadelphia, the nation's temporary capital at the time. President George Washington presented him with a special peace medal, a large oval of silver plate engraved with an image of Washington on the right side shaking Red Jacket's hand. Red Jacket wore this medal on his chest in every portrait painted of him. Red Jacket was known by the Seneca as Sago Yiwata, which roughly translates to, "He keeps them awake." This name was given to him by his fellow Seneca around 1780 in recognition of his oratory skill. Red Jacket was known for his intellectual prowess and his skill at identifying and articulating the inconsistencies and contradictions in white European culture and white European policies toward the native peoples. In 1805, Red Jacket gave a speech to the U.S. Senate that became known as Religion for the White Men and the Red. In this speech, Red Jacket peacefully argued that both natives and Europeans should have the right to worship as they saw fit. Red Jacket spoke out tirelessly on behalf of his people, despite the fact that it was clear to him that all resistance was vain and hopeless. Red Jacket struggled with alcoholism and regretted the day he took his first drink. In his final years, Red Jacket lived in a cabin on the Buffalo Creek Reservation, very close to the Indian cemetery that is today Seneca Indian Park, although the precise location of Red Jacket's cabin at Buffalo Creek is unknown. Upon his death at approximately 80 years of age in 1830, he was buried in the Indian cemetery. His remains were removed from that location in the 1850s and later reburied with several fellow Senecas at Forest Lawn Cemetery in North Buffalo in 1884, where a monument was erected in his honor. The following Chief Red Jacket quotation is inscribed at the base of the monument. "When I am gone, and my warnings are no longer heeded, the craft and avarice of the white man will prevail. My heart fails me when I think of my people, so soon to be scattered and forgotten." Mary Jemison was born on board a ship called the Mary William en route to America from what is today Northern Ireland in 1742 or 1743. Jemison wrote that her Irish parents, Thomas and Jane Jemison, left their native land to escape civil wars and religious rules that prevented them from worshipping as they wanted. In 1758, during the French and Indian War, a war fought in North America between the British and the French, 15-year-old Mary was captured from her home in southern Pennsylvania by a raiding party of Shawnee and French, who killed most of her family. At Fort Duquesne, located in what is today downtown Pittsburgh, she was sold to the Seneca Indians. She was adopted into the Seneca tribe, took on their customs, as well as the name Degawanus, which means two falling voices. As a young woman, Mary took a Delaware husband named Sheninjee and gave birth to a daughter who died in infancy, followed by a son she named Thomas. In the 700-mile trek from their home in Ohio to the banks of the Genesee River, her first husband, Sheninjee, died. Mary was taken in by her husband's family, and she eventually remarried a Seneca named Hayakatu, giving birth to 6 more children with him. After the American Revolutionary War broke out, and as European settlers began to take more and more of the land that was once home to the Native Americans, life became increasingly difficult for Mary's adopted people. Through negotiations at the Treaty of Big Tree, Mary, known in her community as the White Woman of the Genesee, was instrumental in helping safeguard almost 18,000 acres of land known as the Gardeau Reservation. Eventually, most of the Gardeau Reservation was sold, and in 1831 Mary sold off title to the last 2-acre parcel of land reserved for her use and moved to the Buffalo Creek Reservation, where she passed away in 1833 at age 90. At approximately 80 years of age in 1824, Mary told her life story to Minister James Seaver, who published Narrative of the Life of Mrs. Mary Jemison in 1824. Mary Jemison was first buried in the Mission Cemetery at Buffalo Creek. Her remains were reinterred in the Glen Iris estate of American businessman William Pryor Letchworth, the current site of Letchworth State Park, in 1874. She is buried at a spot near her former home on the Gardeau Reservation. Jemison's gravesite is marked with a bronze statue. Humphrey Tolliver was an African-American runaway slave born in Virginia around 1794. In his early adult life, he worked as a cook on shipping vessels on Lake Erie. In 1813, while the village of Buffalo was recovering from its destruction at the hands of the British during the War of 1812, Humphrey Tolliver built a home in the heart of the Buffalo Creek Reservation, on the northeast perimeter of the Indian Cemetery. It is unknown how the arrangement was made for him to build a home on an Indian reservation. The home's original location would be in the middle of present-day Fields Avenue, but the home was moved a short distance when Fields Avenue was paved. Tolliver married a red-headed Irish woman named Nancy Ann Carl, with whom he raised 12 children, tilled his tract of land, and earned the respect of the Senecas living at Buffalo Creek. Tolliver spent much of his time hunting and fishing with his sons. His marriage was described as an unusually happy one, and the couple was a familiar sight in the area. Mrs. Tolliver always wore a veil as protection from the stares of the curious. After the departure of the Seneca from the Buffalo Creek Reservation, following the dissolution of the reservation in the early 1840s, Tolliver became the self-appointed custodian of the Indian Cemetery. He occasionally permitted white settlers to be buried in the cemetery lot, but he only buried white settlers a distance away from the buried Indians and the distance from the sacred area around the ancient walnut tree where the Seneca chiefs were buried. Humphrey Tolliver and his wife had the rare experience of being present to witness the transition of my childhood neighborhood from woodlands to farmland to real estate development. The Tolliver house was destroyed in 1940. The Senecas left the village in the early to mid-1840s. The Indian church and cemetery fell into disuse. The church was used for some time as a barn. Neighbors stripped it of usable lumber, and it eventually blew down in a storm around 1870. The mission house remained standing until it was destroyed in 1920 to make way for the construction of Public School 70 in 1922. The school was renamed Indian Park Academy during my childhood in the late 1970s or early 1980s and closed in 2002. By 1894, the portion of the Indian Cemetery that would later become Seneca Indian Park belonged to a parcel of land that had been sold to celery farmer Allen D. Strickler, who built a large house and barn at 136 Buffum Street in 1887. The house today stands opposite Seneca Indian Park on Buffum Street. Allen Strickler and his wife Emma Strickler are pictured in the upper right. In 1894, the New York State Legislature passed a bill to dispose of the Indian Cemetery that required the removal of all the remains. Over 700 bodies, buried over hundreds of years, were reportedly removed along with relics by the barrel. As the landowner, it was Mr. Strickler's responsibility to pay for the disinterment. By this time, many of the honored Indian chiefs and others had already been disinterred and reinterred elsewhere. The 700 bodies removed in 1894 were reburied in Howard Cemetery on Ridge Road. In February 1905, Mr. Strickler offered to sell the 1.5-acre cemetery to the city of Buffalo. As the city began to take steps to fund the purchase, businessman and philanthropist John Larkin of the Larkin Soap Company and his wife, Frances Hubbard Larkin, purchased the plot of land and gave it to the city as a Christmas present in 1909, requesting that the new city park be named Seneca Indian Park. Mrs. Larkin's mother had taught at the Seneca Mission House in her youth. Pictured here is the Larkin Building, designed by architect Frank Lloyd Wright and completed in 1906 at 680 Seneca Street. Many Senecas returned in October 1910 to conduct a farewell ceremony. A crew was working to level the grounds of the cemetery as it was being converted into a park. They approached the foreman during the lunch break and asked permission to hold a service. The Seneca Indian Park was dedicated on June 29, 1912. The Senecas had objected to the use of their sacred ground as a park. It was their understanding that the Mission Church and the burial ground were excluded from the sale of their lands and that it remained Seneca land. 16-year-old Floretta Poudre, daughter of Chief Poudre of the Tonawanda Indians, was chosen to express these objections at the dedication ceremony, but she was not allowed to do so. Mrs. Larkin, who sympathized deeply with the Senecas, did not attend the dedication ceremony, likely as a form of protest. A large granite boulder was brought from the Larkins' farm in Queenston, Ontario as a marker. A bronze plaque with an inscription was attached to the boulder. According to two sources, the bronze plaque is in the shape of a deerskin, and according to another source, is in the shape of a wolfskin. In the 1940s, the wrought iron gate around the park was removed, so the metal could be used to make munitions for World War II. Between 1948 and 1952, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers constructed the Mount Morris Dam on the Genesee River south of Rochester, New York. The Genesee River Valley was a long-standing traditional home of the Seneca prior to the establishment of Indian reservations. It was also among the locations from which the Seneca were scattered to places such as the Buffalo Creek Reservation as a result of the Sullivan Campaign's merciless destruction of Indian villages during the American Revolution in 1779. The waters of the Mount Morris Dam inundated sacred Indian burial grounds. On June 22, 1952, a small leaden box containing bones of unknown Indians from the Genesee River Valley was buried in Seneca Indian Park. W. Clifford Shongo, a Seneca Indian of the Wolf Clan, said, "The bones we will place in the unknown grave will be symbolic of the hundreds of our ancestors destined to watery graves." By 1980, the Seneca Indian Park was neglected and vandalized. The bronze plaque had been stolen from the granite boulder. A reproduction of the plaque was installed on the granite boulder in a rededication ceremony on October 23, 1992. This effort was led in part by Ellen Jemison, a descendant of Mary Jemison. Several members of the Seneca Nation were present, including Norma Poudre, a niece of the young Floretta Poudre, who had been prevented from speaking at the initial dedication ceremony 80 years earlier. In 2009, the Buffalo Sewer Authority executed a project that required digging through portions of Indian Church Road that were once the site of the Seneca Mission Church and the surrounding churchyard, which was used for burial of members of that community. Human remains were found during the course of the project, as they were disturbed and unearthed in the process. This is Ephraim George Squire's map of the area in 1848. I have highlighted the locations of the graves of Chief Red Jacket, marked A, and Mary Jemison, marked B, as well as the location of the mission house on Buffum Street. Using my knowledge of the location of the mission house and the location of the ridge that continues to be visible in Seneca Indian Park, I turned Squire's map of the area to match an 1894 map that is positioned in the traditional manner with respect to directionality. On both the 1848 and the 1894 maps, I have highlighted the location of the Mission House, the Mission Church, the Tolliver House, Buffum Street, Indian Orchard Place, which is my street, and the locations of the original graves of Chief Red Jacket and Mary Jemison. The grave sites are marked by a red vertical rectangle. This slide shows a current 2013 Google map of the area paired with the 1894 map. Notice that if my calculations are correct, and they might be, the graves of Chief Red Jacket and Mary Jemison were located beneath my childhood home or extremely close to it on Indian Orchard Place. Given the fact that the original burial ground was approximately 4 acres, and the current Seneca Indian Park is approximately 1.5 acres, it is certain that the original burial ground was large enough to include a wide area around the existing park. I added the location of the home into which I was born in 1968 at 21 Junior Avenue to the Google map. If my calculations are correct, both that home at 21 Junior Avenue and my other childhood home at 11 Indian Orchard Place fall within or on the perimeter of the Mission Church churchyard. This final map slide shows a Google satellite image of the area in 2013. Notice the lush green of the tree canopy over Seneca Indian Park. The names listed on the following slides are streets, parks, schools, towns, and even one expressway with names of Indian origin in the Buffalo area, mostly very close to my childhood home. It is puzzling to me that before recently, I never turned my attention to the reality of the Native American history of Buffalo, despite the great number of references to it all around me while growing up. I played in Indian Park. I spent many hours perched on top of the granite boulder at the center of the park. I spent even more hours perched in a tree steps from that boulder. I participated in battles with other kids flinging walnuts at each other, which I now know fell from walnut trees sacred to the Seneca. I played on the playground of Indian Park Academy and taught myself to play tennis by hitting balls on the back wall of the school building. I explored and built forts in the undeveloped fields behind the school property. In the winters, I went sledding with other kids in the neighborhood in a field behind Indian Park Academy that we always called Strickler's Hill. There was talk of Old Man Strickler, but in fact, we had no idea of who he was. I gazed out onto Cazenovia Park from many of my Catholic elementary school classrooms. While in Buffalo for a visit recently, I was suddenly stunned by the range and number of proper nouns in Buffalo of native origin. Upon further reflection, I realized that all of the following places were located on streets with native names: the childhood homes of both of my parents and myself, the elementary and high schools of myself and all my siblings, my father's church, and even my father's workplace. I work as the teacher librarian at Inter-American Magnet School in Chicago, Illinois. The school provides dual language instruction in Spanish and English, emphasis on issues of social justice, and a social sciences curriculum known as the Curriculum of the Americas. Our students study the ancient peoples of the Americas and make connections between those cultures and issues and challenges today in parts of the world where those ancient peoples once thrived. The students study the Taínos of the Caribbean, the Inca, the Maya, the Aztecs, the Mississippians, and others. I have enjoyed learning about these peoples while supporting my students in their learning in the school library program. However, until recently, I had not directed my attention to the history of my own place of origin, my own childhood neighborhood. I was always vaguely aware of the fact that Indian Park itself had been a native burial ground, but my knowledge of it extended no further than that. During my recent visit to Buffalo, I reached out to my family and several of the neighbors to gauge their awareness of the history of the area. Most, like me, had only a very vague idea, although many of their comments actually aligned with what I have learned in recent weeks. While growing up, the little that I did know seemed so distant and unrelated to my own personal experience as a child that it just seemed worlds away from me. It might as well have been extraterrestrial beings or dinosaur remains. I never took the initiative to explore further. Today, I find myself shocked at my own lack of curiosity and awareness regarding the very ground that was beneath my feet for all those years. Becoming aware of this history represents a very powerful awakening for me. At age 45, events that occurred in South Buffalo over the last 200 years don't seem as far off as they did at the ages of 12 or 25 or even 35. This new information represents my newfound inter-American story and my place in it. The Spanish conquest, the European colonization and Christianization of the Americas, the shot heard round the world, manifest destiny, the promise of America. Here is where I fit into that. As the village of Buffalo swelled into the city of Buffalo, with new immigrant families arriving in the 1800s to support a transportation and manufacturing hub on Lake Erie, the Native American presence in western New York was quickly all but extinguished. The woodlands gave way to farms, which quickly gave way to single home tracts. As new streets were cut and the present configuration of streets was established, sacred lands were desecrated, deals were made, promises were broken repeatedly, and much of the history presented here was largely forgotten. It's very clear from the street maps that Indian Orchard Place, my own street, was created last, so that 12 more white European families could move onto a quiet dead-end street in South Buffalo. My family was the third to own our house. When we moved into that home in 1972, there were still a number of original homeowners on the block. So what have I learned from this? I suppose it's that for cultures, ideas, and ideals to continue to flourish, people have to make an effort, be alert to their surroundings, and fight to preserve and pass on the aspects of their heritage that make them who they are and who they want to be. Thank you.